I'm going to go ahead and begin. And I want to, first of all, welcome everybody. And on behalf of the full-time faculty at the College of Professional Studies Master of Science in Organizational Leadership Program, Dr. Teresa Goode, Dr. Nancy Pawlyshyn, and Dr. Sriram Rajagopalan, and me, Les Stein, I want to welcome you to this academic year's second Leadership Matters webinar of 3. And please note that the presentation will be recorded, and we welcome your questions and comments in the chat box, which will be monitored throughout the session. If you've been paying close attention to the many challenges facing us domestically and globally, from bank failures in recent days to social injustice that seems to have no end, you should realize that most, if not all, of this comes down to one word. And I'm very passionate about this one word because I think it basically drives everything that we do in this world and everything that happens to us, and that is leadership. And that is what we are here to discuss. Our scheduled speaker for today's webinar, Vicki Hubbard, will not be able to join us for personal reasons, but I can honestly say that in the immortal words of a famous movie about a boxer many, many years ago, the title of the movie was "Somebody Up There Likes Me." And that's exactly what happened, because we have a treat for you. Our special guest is Dr. Karl Reid, who currently serves as Senior Vice Provost and Chief Inclusion Officer at Northeastern University. He also holds the title of Professor of the Practice in the College of Professional Studies, Graduate School of Education. I wish I had time to share Dr. Reid's full bio, but it would take too long, and to be honest, it would also take your breath away. Let me simply say that Dr. Reid has accomplished more in a few short years than most people would aspire to in 2 or 3 lifetimes. Karl comes from humble beginnings in New York City, graduated from MIT twice, undergraduate and graduate, and received his Doctor of Education degree from Harvard University. He has worked in senior leadership positions at the National Society of Black Engineers, the United Negro College Fund, served as Associate Dean of Undergraduate Education and Director of the Office of Minority Education at MIT, and he sits on more boards, advisory councils, and committees that have a direct impact on people's lives, especially those who have been marginalized by our society, than I can count. He's also the author of Working Smarter, Not Just Harder, 3 Sensible Strategies for Succeeding in College and Life, and he has contributed to numerous commentary pieces in national publications. Karl, it is my pleasure, an absolute pleasure, to welcome you and to thank you for joining us today. Our discussion today is about the role of leadership in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Karl, can I ask you to please provide us with some opening remarks? And once you're finished, let's open it up for some discussion, some questions, and then open discussion about this issue. With that, Karl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Les. And it is really an honor to be a part of this discussion. When you reached out to me and your colleagues, I jumped at the opportunity. I've always been a student of leadership. I've watched from afar and near leaders who direct and have responsibility for various entities, whether there be higher education. I was very close to the presidents of MIT and other institutions as well. I was the head of the Institute for Capacity Building, or at least oversaw the Institute for Capacity Building at United Negro College Fund, so 37 college presidents, and engaging. I look at leaders of our country, the presidents and the senators and others who lead, and I'm fascinated by leadership and the ability to move organizations strategically. My father was never finished college. He graduated. He went to Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, and dropped that after 2 years to join the Navy. And then my mother never went to college. I was born in Canada from Bayesian roots, but education was always valued. But one of the things my dad appreciated also were organizations. And I remember a copy of a book he gave me as a kid called The Organization Man. And then later on, I was very fortunate to become a part of an organization out of New York City called the Bishop's Leadership Project, that took young men and developed their leadership skills, everything from learning how to give short speeches to analyzing critical literature, from Malcolm X to Marcus Garvey. And then when I was an undergraduate, I decided to run for national office to become the national chair of the National Society of Black Engineers. I barely knew how to spell the National Society of Black Engineers, but I became that. And as a gift under my senior year, when I graduated from MIT, my father gave me Ken Blanchard's book, The 1 Minute Manager. And so I learned about different leadership models all throughout my In Search of Excellence, Tom Peters' work. These are the kinds of things that really I was exposed to early on. I'm thrilled to be a part of the Northeastern University community, and to follow another amazing leader in Joseph Ayoun. I tell people that Joseph is modeling, and I tell him actually, he's modeling a kind of leadership that I've never modeled or never saw, which I call agile leadership. The ability to move quickly in an organization like Northeastern as quickly as he does with the leadership and the leadership team is quite amazing. And one day I'm going to write a book. Maybe I'll partner with Les and Nancy and Teresa and others to write a book about this agile leadership, because it is pretty remarkable that 120 plus year old institution with 59,000 people who are part of this in 14 countries and 3 countries and 4 sites can move as quickly as it does. So I think that it's a model for us. But then at the end of the day, we should ask the question, so what, right? Great leaders, as we've known, have done deleterious things as well. And so we should really be asking ourselves the question, with all of these great models, I've often asked myself, what's the so what question? And at the end of the day, my push, my vision is to ensure that people are better for my leadership. People and organizations are better as a result of my role that I play in their lives, whether mentoring a freshman in college or driving the DEI strategy for Northeastern University. That's really my model, that's message of leadership. So I look forward to engaging in a deeper conversation about leadership with a purpose.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karl. And what I really like are a couple of things. Number one, that every book you mentioned I have on my shelf. So that's good right from the beginning. Second, a lot of our background and our roots with parents and family are kind of very similar to mine. And I don't know, I wonder if that maybe sometimes makes a difference in how people view things, because they come from, as I say, more humble beginnings and working class. But you touched on this, Karl, and I appreciate this, especially as you were talking about Dr. Ayoun and the vision that he has for the university. And there are others, obviously, globally, but not enough. I would say not enough of them is where we are right now. But in your professional experiences and the research and the work you've done, and maybe within the university as well, what do you find as the leadership style or the skill that works best in creating a culture? And because I tell my students always, culture is equal to leadership. You have a great leader, you have a good culture. You have a great culture, you'll probably find a great leader. So what style or styles do you find that create that great organizational culture, especially relative to making DEI a priority, so that it becomes part of the organization? That we don't have to, that you no longer have to talk about it, is what I'm saying, that we just live it. Where do you see that?
Yeah, one of the things that President Ayoun said to me when he hired me was, you should make yourself irrelevant. And I thought he was letting me go at that point. I wondered what he meant by that. He said, no, let me explain. He says, I actually want to be relevant as a president, which means that you put the structures in place, the systems in place to repeat itself. There's a great book by David Peter Stroh called Systems Thinking for Social Change. And Stroh talks about great organizations are those, or any organizations are those, that if you kind of remove some of the practices, they will come back together and continue to perform at really high levels. Those of us who are following sports teams and others, and we look at the Patriots, until recently, even the year that Tom Brady went down, the quarterback went down with an injury, I think it was 2005, they were 11-5 because they had the structure, the system, and it reinforced itself. So great leaders really focus on that. When I was with IBM, I came out of school and went to work for IBM. They introduced me to this notion called transformational leadership. And basically there was a theme in transformational leadership that says managers manage within paradigms, leaders lead across paradigms. Managers are those who focus on what some call the known knowns, the things that are repeatable, the things that are process-oriented. They basically meet the fundamental needs of an organization. But great leaders are those who also can manage the unknown unknowns, the things that are innovative, the problem solve, the purpose-driven types of things as well. And so great leaders know when to move from known knowns to unknown unknowns, from managers to leader as well. You can't continue to be just a leader without taking care of the people, right? That's the known knowns. But you can't continue to just focus on that and miss the opportunities that are the unknown unknowns, because otherwise you'll be blockbuster video, right? So knowing how to do this. But you touched on something very, very powerful, and that is culture. Culture, as a budding sociologist, I really think about culture as the norms, the behaviors, the activities, the values of an organization. Someone once wrote, your values are what you would allow, right? Or values are defined by what you would allow, the behaviors that you would allow. So great leaders give attention to the culture. And I work for a manager, and I wouldn't call him a leader, who said, there's no culture here in this organization. And all of us reporting to him looked at each other and said, what are you talking about? And it's because he was in the fishbowl. He defined the water and the water temperature, but didn't realize it was water as a result. And I would argue that great leaders are aware of everything in the fishbowl, and to use that as a metaphor. And it's a terrible metaphor because it's so defining, but great leaders are one who give attention to individuals as well, and then expect everyone to kind of operate out of a value system that is unique to that is defined to the organization, but in a way that is unique to them. And so I love the one more model that I kind of I've employed in many of the projects that I lead called collective impact. Collective impact brings together public-private partners to accomplish complex social problems. And the brilliant thing about collective impact, it starts with everyone agreeing to a common agenda. Everyone kind of nods and says, these are the things that we are all going to focus on. And then the second is shared measurement metrics. These are how we all agreed to measure our progress. I think, I forget the name of the book, but I mean, I know the name of the book. I forget the author who wrote, I think it's Teresa Goode, who wrote a book called The Progress Principle, that everybody has to feel that they are moving forward. So these are the things that we are moving forward. These are how we're going to be measured. But then the third element of collective impact, and we can go into that during the Q&A if we want to, is called mutually reinforcing activities. So great leaders, I believe, are those that allow people to operate within their gifts and talents around those mutually reinforced activities that achieve the common outcomes. And I one quick example, and I'll allow you to go to another question. I used to run software projects. That was when I came out of IBM. I went to work for a couple of software companies. And we introduced this notion, one here in Cambridge, called program management. And I would never sit down and tell a developer how to code, how to program. I would never tell the QA person how to test. I would never tell the salesperson how to sell. or the systems engineer how to support the products and support the companies. But we would all agree that these are the requirements that we were all working toward. And it became a cross-functional matrix opportunity to deliver on the common themes and common outcomes, in this case, the common products as well. So I believe great leaders are really good at that. And I'm still working on it after many, many years, trying to become that in that way. So those are the models, the transformational leadership model, the good to great model, which is Jim Collins' work on level 5 organizations, right. And also Liz Wiseman's work on multipliers. Great leaders are those who are comfortable with people who are smarter than them in there, and they can effectively get 150%, according to Wiseman, performance and productivity out of people. Versus diminishers, and we've all worked for them, who have to be the smartest person in the room. And they only get 50% productivity out of them because they spend the other 50% watching their back. Now, with regards to DEI, and those are just general models, I think that Liz Wiseman's work, as I mentioned, the good to great level 5, but to servant leadership, Robert Greenleaf's notion of servant leadership, at the end of the day, is probably the most effective model for DEI leadership. And it's still evolving. DEI leadership is still evolving. But the question that Robert Greenleaf asks is, do those served grow as a person? Do they grow as an organization? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servant leaders? That, to me, is a true model of leadership. And that's what I found in the DEI space, true servant leadership. That's what Dr. O'Brien on the phone, on the line is like. And that's what many of our leaders are here at Northeastern. Wow. That's good. You had me somewhat mesmerized here for a minute, so I've got to come out of my little stupor here, because that was a great, that was fantastic summary of some huge ideas, if you will, and thank you. That really was, it was fabulous. So. And I want to encourage, by the way, everybody on the video, if you have a question, just put it in the chat box, please. We have some folks here who are ready to read them out to Dr. Reid and ask him. So we'd love to get your point, so you don't just hear mine or my faculty staff asking. But since we don't have any just yet, so I want to. And by the way, one of my former students, Ellen, said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, as Peter Drucker would have said. And yeah, very, very, very true. Very well put. And thank you, Ellen. So again, if you have any questions or any comments, please put them in the chat box. So let's take that one step further, Carl, if I could, and take servant leadership, the transformational concept, of course, in turning your organization around to going in that direction. So that's a skill that it really is a huge skill for leaders. How can such leaders effectively demonstrate when it comes to DEI initiatives within their organizations? What does it take to have, or does it have to? Do you have to demonstrate your commitment to DEI? As I see very often, you get this kind of in a box, and it says, well, we're hiring women, we're hiring minorities, we're hiring Asians. Okay, so wonderful. I'm glad you're on board with that. But what else is there that could demonstrate clearly through actions and behaviors, whether it's a servant leader or transformation leader, that they're honestly making a concerted effort to make DEI part of, as we go back to the culture, as opposed to just on the surface showing you with numbers, quantitative versus the qualitative piece of how it can be done. I wonder if you can address that. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that there's an active debate in the DEI space as well, and that is: do you need diversity in order to have inclusion, or do you need inclusion before you can have diversity? Right? It's the push and the pull in this space. My argument, and I have a model based on this, and that's this whole notion of meaningful interactions, right? It's the Sylvia Hurtado's work that she's done at the University of Michigan to look at, and as well as those who have done a lot of work on implicit bias. When you have meaningful interactions with people who are peers, who are different, it challenges one's perspectives. It often mitigates one's bias, the biases that we have about that particular reference group, because we as human beings, we have a natural tendency to kind of put people in boxes. That's a human defense strategy that we all have, largely to free up mental space and capacity space to focus on the things that are novel, right? The things that are novel become normal, just so that we can free up time to be able to identify true threats as well. So the more you interact with people who are different, who are threatening, et cetera, in other ways, and that may be an active threat, or that may be in terms of seeing a Black person on the street or whatever, or a white male, or whatever it is, or implicit threat that we all have when we see. And there's been research that shows that when people see people of color, if the features are exactly the same from one shade to the other, it introduces, the darker the shade, introduces a threat mechanism in our amygdala. So the more we interact with people who are different, the less likely we'll see people and differences as threats. And as a result, less likely to experience as microaggressions, right? Those things where we ask somebody those inappropriate things that are just those 1,000 cuts. Where are you from? No, where are you really from, right? Or should you be in this class? Or those kind of messages that one gets that are innocent, could be inadvertent and innocent. You're more likely to be aware and sensitive to interrupt those processes if you have the interaction with people who are different. And that, I'm not talking about occasional interaction, I'm talking about deep, respectful, co-respectful interaction. So I make the case that having diversity is a means to that end. You have to have the numbers in order to have those serendipitous collisions that occur that challenge one's biases and create an environment of much more opening and welcoming environments.
Wow.
And then at the end of the day, and inclusion is a culture and a climate that is, up to 2 years ago, I said, was the goal. Creating inclusive environments is a goal. Now, again, part of my learning is, I would say, belonging is a goal. That feeling a sense that I am a part of something, a part of a group that cares about me as an individual. And I've written about this in Calypso in our newsletter. Find me a person who feels that they're in the context where they feel to belong, and I'll show you a person who thrives. In order to do that, you have to have an inclusive environment. You have to have an equitable environment. And in my argument, you should have a diverse environment as well.
Wow. Fantastic. Wow. You know what that brought to mind, and we're gonna go, we have a couple of questions on the chat box, and I'm gonna ask Teresa to read the first one in just a second. But you know what that drives home for me, Karl, is that, and many people know, I grew up, if you will, in the Marine Corps. From very early age, as a teenager, basically, and on for about almost 3 decades, I lived in the Marine Corps. Everything you just said, after the 60s, especially the turmoil of the 60s, especially with the assassination of Dr. King, and the things that we had to deal with, you joined the Marine Corps, and you then realize that you're living with people that you normally would not have interacted with but that environment, and given the mission that you're dealing with, you're forced into that situation. And with time, it's just unbelievable to see the relationships that come out, and we can't do that, unfortunately, in society, because, I mean, you see each other at work, you go home, and you deal with the people you want to deal with on the weekends and on the holidays. But over there, you end up, and it creates that bond, that relationship that people can say, I really don't see the color. I don't see that difference. I don't see, because everything is, and that's fascinating for me to have heard that, because I related that back to my upbringing, and so I keep wondering, why am I the only one that invites a Black person or invites a Hispanic person to dinner and gets to know them and his friends? Well, it's because of that environment that I grew up in, as opposed to, and that's what we would try to lead to reach, and ultimately, and that's our noble goal. But with that, Teresa, can I ask you to read the first one?
Sure, and I think this is a question from Shashi, and a really nice follow-up question to the discussion on inclusion and what's the goal of inclusion, which is, from your experience, how can leaders ensure that everyone's voice is heard and valued?
That's a great question, and that is truly the definition of inclusion. Right up here, we have the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. Early on, when we relaunched our office, we set our core values of trust, relationship and respect, understanding and empathy, and it's kind of our true values, as we say. It's not the hardware store true value. It's what we talk about. So how do we do that? And actually, there's a really good questions. I think that we've got to build in an understanding for leadership as to the why that's this is important. I shared with you, and I came out of school, I went to work for IBM, and one of the things that IBM did is trained us to listen to a customer, listen to their needs, and then prepare a solution based on that need. Now, in IBM, that solution was always a mainframe, but that's another story. But listen to their needs as well. And so when I come into this work, I lead with listening, and great leaders do that. They understand that the value of inclusion is one that benefits the whole organization. So I kind of and I'm mixing metaphors, but in science we have to make sure that the units on the right side of the equation match the units on the left side of the equation when you're solving for a problem. And so I find out what those units are that's important for a leader. And the units that are important for a leader are shareholder value, market presence, employee turnover, employee satisfaction, et cetera. Well, by the way, all of those are associated with inclusion. Because you have an inclusive environment, you're going to have employees that are happy, you're going to have employees that stay, you're going to have employees that perform at very high levels, that sense of belonging. There's a lot of literature now that shows that. So that's really how I start with leadership. I said, this is important for you or for organizations as well, and then work their way backwards. Now, there are some who just kind of are just going to say, I'm not going to move, I'm not going to change, this is the way I am, I'm never going to change, et cetera, et cetera. Then you really appeal to other organizations. You started to look for a way to become tempered radicals, what Deborah Meyerson talks about, just becoming a tempered radical to begin to change the organization from inside. But how do you convince a leader? You really show that doing so will benefit that leader, that woman, that person who leads the organization by the things that matter to them.
Oh, fantastic. That great point. Again, I was going to ask another question from that's mine or part of my group, but I would like to respect the folks that are here. And Nancy, can I ask you to read the next one?
Sure. This actually dovetails with what Karl's talking about right now. Stephanie in Toronto would like to hear more about the practice of empathetic leadership. We know how critical empathy is, she writes, in leadership for everything from innovation to retention to general sense of belonging and positive culture. And so could you speak to empathetic leadership, Karl? And we have more questions coming in as well.
Yeah, so I've never frankly put those two words together, Stephanie, to be honest with you. So I'm going to freelance here a little bit. I think that there should not be a qualifier to leadership called empathetic. I think all leadership should be empathetic. I think that this whole notion of walking a mile in another person's shoes puts them into a better place. So Les and I talked about our background and experiences, and as a result of that, we are much more alert to people who've had a kind of a rough upbringing, whatever that is, right? Because of those experiences. And I have found great leaders to be one who listen first. I think there's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And I think there's a notion of quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I think great leaders are like that. And if you read Jim Collins' work on Good to Great and the Level 5 leader, when he cites, I think, the leaders of Gillette, right? You don't even know who that is, right? But yet Gillette continues to be a thriving organization because of that Level 5 leader. And so I really believe passionately that great leaders are those who are there. Now, how do you introduce empathy to someone who doesn't have it? And you just kind of hope that there are people around who ensure that the leader who does emerge in that leader is the one who is most empathetic, right? I think in the old school, in the 60s and 70s, we valued the Lee Iacocca's of the world, who just went ahead and did what they wanted to do, and so to drive that leadership, that model of he used to say, lead, follow, get out of the way, right? That was his notion. I don't think that's the way, and I think certainly Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, they're not following leaders like that anymore. So I think that the lesson should be learned from those who are younger, who are really become influencers. And the influencers are those who are not necessarily the loudest, but the most relational. And in order to be relational, you have to be empathetic.
Oh, very nice. And as we know, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. And then you take that to the next level. John Maxwell's dictum, obviously that goes right with what you said. We have a couple more questions online, but I do want to ask you something, because I don't want to have to go to bed tonight saying that I didn't ask this question. So because I would like to get your thoughts. Where in your experiences, based on what you've seen, and I think, knowing you now for a little while, I've heard you talk about, because your challenge is creating that real environment, that culture that's DEI focused, but you've also seen the other half. Where do you think most leaders fail when in creating a DEI environment within their organizations? What is the area that causes failure in that area? And what part of leadership is impacted by that, if you will?
Yes, I think that, boy, I tell you, you're a great question. We could probably write a book about this too. So first of all, and this is David Peter Stroh's work, and he's built on Peter Senge's fifth discipline, and he talks about the first step in all of this is introspective. I just signed up with an executive coach. So I'm a certain age, of a person of a certain age. I've been working since I was 24 years old. I'm now 60. And I've been doing this a long time. And yet I just signed up for an executive coach because I felt that I've plateaued in a number of areas. And so I think the first great leaders fail when they don't recognize their hidden, their blind spots and the unintended impacts of their behaviors as well. And I don't even want to say the intended impact, but because that's another problem, but the unintended impacts of that. And I think that great leaders, especially with regard to DEI, are really comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so one thing about, to his credit, Joseph, he'll say flat out that he was caught flat-footed when George Floyd was murdered. And the Black students on campus really rose up and said, we've got a problem, as well as probably faculty and staff as well. we've got a problem. He will just put himself out there. He said he started to listen as well. Number two, so they fail to recognize the unintended impact, and they're not especially comfortable with being uncomfortable. Number two, they fail to see it as a system, right? DEI is a system. So your first question, there tend to be the focus on, let's just get our numbers up, right? Let's just go out to HBCUs and tell them how great we are, and then they will recruit and we'll solve all the problems. But everything is a system. We have to give attention to inclusion. We have to give attention to equity. We have to give attention to our ecosystems and our connection to our communities. And we have to build in accountability, right? So that we can ensure that the behaviors and the systems are put in place so that's repeatable. They also fail to move DEI into the critical path of an organizational mission. So and then back to this whole notion that about matching the units, right? If we could sort of frame, and I believe we do this well at Northeastern, although there's still some work to do, but if we could frame DEI in terms of the organizational mission, so it is really important for us to do that. It can't be an appendage. It can't be a supplement. It can't be something. It has to be incorporated into everything we do. So to our credit, when I sat down with David Madigan on the very early days, our provost, and he said, Karl, we are really shaping our 2030 academic plan. And unlike the 2025 academic plan, we don't want to make DEI another pillar, a sixth pillar. We want to incorporate into all six of the pillars. And so if you read the 2030 plan, it starts off with diversity. And it says specifically that being an inclusive university is not the last question, it's the first question. It actually uses that language. And so leaders who fail to see that, fail to see how important it is and how central to the mission of the organization will never really achieve this as well. And then finally, and this is really key, and I've alluded to this earlier, they hide their own learning and insecurity. Cole Camplis, and I'll call him out, head of ITS, early in my tenure here, he reached out to me and said, Karl, I want to learn. I want to understand. I'm not an expert in this, and I want to learn. And I could probably name 4 or 5 other people who had that conversation with me early on. And then he went ahead and did that in front of his whole team of 200, whatever the number is as well, and talked about that. I think great leaders don't hide their own learning and their own insecurity about this, but actually put that out. And one of my favorite professors, he taught economics of education, macroeconomics at Harvard Ed School, Dick Murnane. He had a stuttering problem. And he actually, a stuttering challenge, not a problem, but a challenge. And he actually stood up in the very first day of class. He said, I have a stuttering challenge, I stutter. And he said, I stutter when I get nervous. And so when I'm stuttering, don't shrink back in your seats. Help me with the word I'm struggling with. And so it kind of changed the whole tone in that whole class of 65. One of the most enjoyable classes I had. One of the ones I learned most, because he put his learning out there, his situation, his vulnerability out there. And I think a lot of leaders hide that and ultimately end up not creating an environment where people feel comfortable sharing their own learning and their own experiences as well.
Fascinating. Fantastic. I hope you don't mind. I could listen to you all day long. But you, by the way,
I wish my wife would say that.
Both of us. But by the way, I'm going to ask Teresa to ask the next question. But before I do that, you just should have seen the way her ears perked up when you said coaching, about the coaching, because she's a certified coach and she's still continuing to get her additional certifications in coaching. And we're working on that as part of our program at CPS to include the certification piece for coaching. So I could just see her eyes just widened a minute ago. But Teresa, why don't you ask the next question?
Sure, I'd be glad to, and I'll throw one more plug in for our program. We are offering a 1 credit course on it's starting in 2 weeks, which is coaching for inclusive leadership. So if anybody's interested, that's starting up. And the next question I have is from Samantha Clark, and is another really nice follow-up to what we're talking about. The question is, how can we continue to learn and ensure that we are fostering inclusivity as leaders now and in the future?
Yeah, you think about the innovation cycle for any new product, any new idea, any new trend. There are the early adopters, early majority, then the late majority, and then the laggards, right? So there are people who will buy that iPhone just because it's an iPhone, the next iPhone 20, whatever, 15, whatever it is, right? They'll just do that. And then there's a group of people who do it because they are in that early majority. They'll be on sort of the leading edge. And then there are other people who do it, frankly, because everybody else is doing it, right? So that's the whole notion of the tipping point that occurs as well. And then the last group of people, the flip phone people, they will do it only because the iOS is no longer supported on their iPhone 2, right? So they'll make the change as well. So I kind of liken that to this question about the inclusion and about the progress that's being made. And I would just say that there will people who learn just because it's a topic that's important to them, et cetera, and creating that. Then there will be people who will learn because it's new and novel, and they really they're kind of curious as well. Then there would be the people who will do it because other people are doing it. And then there are people who just won't do it. And so what you've got to do is create a strategy for all 4 audiences, right? Around this, and a messaging for all 4. The first 4 audience you probably will get it's at hello, right? You know, like Richard O'Brien, he'll show up as soon as you hear D. He won't even say hear DEI, he'll just hear D, right? But then there are people who will come on board if you want to make a good, compelling case for it as well. And then there are others who do it because others. So in those cases, you have to create the structure and the culture so that they will sort of get in line with ultimately the culture. It's what Jeffrey Cohen calls situation crafting. You craft the situation to ensure that people will start to lead to behaviors. And my dissertation research is in social cognitive theory about motivation and achievement of African-American males in higher education, and the power of the environment to kind of shape the expectations and the behaviors and the sense making that people make is critical. And then you have to put policies and practices in place for that last group that just won't do it no matter what. And so you have to ensure that those policies and practices protect the others as well. So I think that's how you do it. You have to kind of customize the messaging, the structures, the environment, the policies and practices in order to really address all 4 or more of these audiences.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. I think I'd like to go to the audience for what we might end up with the last question, because I don't want to keep everybody, but Nancy will ask, Dr. Pawlyshyn will ask this question, and it's kind of nice because the person asking the question is in her class right now, and also in my class. She's taking both classes. Her name is Pearl, and Nancy, go ahead.
Sure. I just want to say I was so glad to hear Karl talk about leaders sharing their vulnerability, because in a session yesterday with Pearl and Sam, who are both on this call, we talked a lot about that as they're preparing TED Talks for my class. So that was perfect. But Pearl's question has to do with the relationship-oriented style of leadership and the task-oriented style of leadership. And she writes, I understand that every organization has its own unique needs, but why is it hard for leaders to find a balance and merge both styles, both the relationship and the task?
That is such a tough question, and a wonderful one, as well as all the questions have been as well. I'm interestingly enough, Pearl, I am not a relationship-oriented leader. I'm an introvert, although I've become a gregarious introvert. And it's not just because of introversion and extroversion, but as I say, I'm a gregarious introvert. I tend to be drawn to things and accomplishments and actions rather than necessarily people. I mean, it's just the nature of who I am, right? My ears, I even noticed it in my house. My ears are tuned to listen to systems in my house and not necessarily the voices in my house. I was just noticing that recently. I could tell when the dishwasher makes more noise than normal. So as a result of that, I know that relationships matter in leadership. It is essential. So I hire good relationship people around me. And I'm very fortunate to do that, who are the first thing to think about relationships and making sure we're cultivating relationships. I don't want to say I use people. That's not the way I want you to see it. But I'll connect with people when it's meaningful to achieve something. But there are people who will connect with people when it's not meaningful, right? They just to connect with people and are really good at it as well. And so as a result of that, I basically am in a position as a leader and a manager to hire to my weaknesses. I recognize what my weaknesses, I hire to my weaknesses and let them fly as well. Because great leaders can do that. Now, there are other ways as well. There are people who are very relational, but not task-oriented. And I challenge the notion that they are really leaders. If they don't achieve something, and I think that what Les talked about earlier about, you said about impact, I think you didn't use the word impact, but you used influence. I think great leaders have to be sort of able to accomplish something, have to lead organizations as well. Having said that, there are people who have the appearance of leadership, but are not task-oriented. They never get anything done. And at the end of the day, I think at some point you start to see that this is not a leader that one would want to follow. So I don't know that, I know that might be controversial and there may be differences of opinion, but I tend to think that you need both in order to really be great leaders. And if somebody has a weakness, back to Liz Weissman's multipliers, right? You hire to your weaknesses in order to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for.
Oh, fantastic. And I would even go one step further, and again, never intending to hurt anybody's feelings, but the bottom line is that the more focused you are on task, the more you're exhibiting managerial skills, because that's where they're asked to perform. And obviously a leader needs to have a little bit of both, but the relational, and you're right, absolutely. And that's the key to the success. And we see that in how they work with and around people. And you made a great point about introvert, extrovert. A lot of people assume that to be a great leader, charismatic, you need to be an extrovert. Well, introverts are extremely good leaders and very often better leaders, but it's exhausting. They're exhausted at the end of the day. And I tend to be the same category as you, Karl, is that at the end of the day, I need some time. Just leave me alone because I need to recover from having done that. And it's kind of an interesting perspective. But again, it's part of the whole leadership perspective. So with that, Sriram, you had your hand up. Is that on purpose?
Yes, I just wanted to add one line of thought to what Karl was telling over here. Karl, I'm just monitoring the chats and stuff like that. So on the security side of it. So I wanted to comment on the fact that the task as well as the relationship are equally important. And it depends upon where you want to lead, because depending upon the maturity level of the team that you are leading or the organization that we are leading, as well as the the level of direction that people are really looking for. Different types of leadership may be, in place. So at some time you have to balance with the task for the direction that they need. Sometimes you need to give them just the nudge and support and stuff like that. So that's exactly what you are trying to tell over here. So both are really required, but depends upon where you apply what. And it really comes down to that particular fact. So just wanted to, throw that line there.
Thank you. And I think a lot of it is also personality driven as well. And to Les's point, I'm exhausted at the end of the day because I put on a kind of a persona for my team, right? I need to keep them motivated and excited about that work. But at the end of the day, my favorite place to be is on an Amtrak train after giving a talk, right? It's in the quiet car. That's exactly because I need to recharge, and I know that about me as well. So thank you for that, and it's a good balance that's necessary.
Thank you, Sriram. Well, I'll tell you what, we are getting just about. We'll probably go over by a minute or two, but I do want to ask Karl, would you mind giving us what are some of your takeaways when it comes to DEI and leadership, the relationship between the two? What would you say are the things that you walk away with, or we should all walk away with at the end of the day?
Yeah, just a few things. I do think this with regard to DEI, which is the theme for this your class, your course. Leadership does matter in DEI. I was with the National Society of Black Engineers, and we published a retention toolkit, that included all of the best practices that we could find for success for underrepresented students in engineering for that time. And the number one was leadership. And we basically surveyed some of the institutions that were producing high numbers of students of color, in this case in engineering. That was our focus. So leadership matters, and we actually provided some key. The second is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Particular diversity makes us better, particularly when problem solving and innovation are the key outcomes. In a standard manufacturing line, diversity actually might slow us down. But in terms of problem solving, innovation, and that's what Scott Cage has found in his work at the University of Michigan. So making the case, the business case at the why, kind of answering the why is key. And then the last thing is, let's not stop at diversity. Let's not stop at equity, which is kind of making sure that people are promoted and hired and reach tenure and salaries, et cetera, are equitable across to avoid unintended gaps that occur. But let's go to inclusion and belonging. Let's make sure that people feel a sense, and that's really the true barometer of a healthy organization. Is there a sense of belonging for every group? And that's why we at Northeastern are monitoring and measuring the sense of diversity, inclusion, and belonging every 2 years. And we disaggregate by groups, we disaggregate by colleges, we disaggregate by location, so we know where there are gaps and what we need to do to close it. So diversity is a means to an end, and the end is belonging, because that's when we'll really thrive.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. I would like to, we'll end with that those great points. And I just love the way that this session was not only, sometimes people have a great deal of difficulty relating the academic and the practical. In other words, people think that people at the university level are at what they call the ivory tower. They just the thinkers and all. This demonstrated the relationship, the very practical relationship between the doing and the studying and the learning and the academic piece. So I couldn't have asked for anything more. I'd like to invite everybody back on, and hopefully we'll even have more people on the 25th of May when Dr. Richard O'Brien, who also, by the way, teaches for the leadership program, the graduate leadership program, will be presenting on the relationship between leadership and social justice and some of the issues there. He is the director of the John D. O'Brien African American Institute at Northeastern University, and we're looking forward to that session. It's going to just continue on with this kind of a discussion about, how do we kind of bring it all together? How do we finally create that world. I won't see it probably in my lifetime. I realize that, but hopefully my grandkids might see more of it. And that would be my goal in life, is to try to ultimately get to that level. But with that, Karl, I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you being here today, sharing your ideas with us. I think you can see from some of the comments that everybody just really loved this presentation. And I wish we could have the 30 million people that live in our country listen to what you just said, because I do believe that I just think that would convince people that this is our direction ought to change. We need to go in a different direction. We need to do things more consciously and for the right reasons. And the fact that, hey, if we get the right leaders setting the tone, setting the example, being the example, I think we can get there. So obviously you've got a long road to hoe, but yeah, step at a time. And I think we're getting there. And I think Northeastern is better for your leadership in DEI and other areas. And I just want to say thank you so much for being part of our group today. And I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate your time. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Take care.
Good job, Karl. Thank you, man.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank